The light bulb is probably one of the most recognizable symbols of the creative process. It's that familiar eureka moment. It sort of encapsulates this idea that creative ideas will sort of spring to mind out of nowhere. That could be while you're out for a walk,
while you're trying to sleep,
while you're in the shower, or anywhere for that matter. Just Googling the word creativity and clicking images gives a pretty good idea of how frequently the light bulb is associated with creativity. And while there is some value to this metaphor, it is by no means the moment of creativity. That would be like saying the moment of baking is shitting it all out after you eat it. Creativity is a process, it's not a single event. In 1926, social psychologist Graham Wallace introduced a 4-stage model of creativity: preparation, incubation, illumination, and verification. Preparation is about gathering the necessary knowledge and feeling out the problem. Incubation is letting the problem fester and bubble in your unconscious. Illumination, aka insight, aka the light bulb, which is what we're talking about, is the moment when the idea pops into your head, seemingly out of nowhere. And verification, which is the judging, evaluating, and actual implementation of the idea. So based on this model, the light bulb only accounts for 25% of the creative process, and that 25% clearly depends on other steps. For example, I'm not going to wake up tonight in a cold sweat and have a flash of insight into my next great symphony. I don't know shit about music, and it's not like it's going to happen overnight. Look, I'm not denying that the moment of insight or the light bulb is something that creative people regularly experience, but what I am denying is the idea that creative thoughts appear out of nothing. Our experience of it probably just feels that way. Wait, hold on a second. Creative people? I thought we were talking about the creative process. Go ahead, name a creative person. Picasso. Sure, he's creative. Einstein? Of course, totally creative. Lady Gaga. Creativity off the charts. Grimes. The point is, this is another way we consider creativity. We can think of it in terms of creative people. But why do we consider them to be creative? Because of the things they produced. Picasso produced paintings, Einstein produced scientific theories, Lady Gaga produces music, Grimes makes OpenAI aircraft children. We make inferences about them as creative people based on their creative products. Now, there's one more way we can think of creativity, and that's known as creative places. Creative place deals with the external environment, things that modify creativity outside of you. So we have people, process, product, and place. These make up what's known as the 4 Ps of creativity. In other words, who is creative, what's considered to be creative, how do we create, and how does our environment influence creativity? So not only is the light bulb metaphor likely a narrow slice of the creative process, but the creative process is also a narrow slice of a much larger idea of creativity. This is just one of the many misunderstandings we have about creativity today. And later in the video, we're actually going to be addressing many, many more of these. But first, we need a proper working definition of creativity. And before we can do that, we need a bit of a history lesson. Buckle up. Disclaimer, the following is a simplified Western understanding of the history of creativity. Our current understanding of creativity is an extremely recent development. From the earliest moments of humankind, there were certainly things that we would consider to be creative today. Tools, agriculture, the alphabet, paintings, pottery, you name it. These would all be considered to be creative, but only in retrospect. We need to be careful here. It's important that we don't write our current cultural understandings of creativity into our past. It's unlikely anyone at the time thought in terms of creativity as we know it today. For example, ancient Greece, a civilization that produced some of the most recognizable creative products in all of human history, they used to believe that creativity was some sort of divine voice or spirit that spoke through you like some sort of fucked up sock puppet. People were seen as merely conduits for creativity from the gods. Specifically, it was the Muses, the 9 goddesses of the arts, literature, and science, who were credited with the knowledge expressed in creative works. For example, Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey explicitly asks the Muses to help him tell the story in the best way possible. The Greek perspective sees creativity as primarily this process of discovery, or imitation in Plato's words, rather than the generation of something novel. The Romans had this notion of the genius, which, surprise, they likely stole from the Greek notion of demons. Okay, I'm kidding, I'm sorry. Okay, I know, the nasty Roman hobbitses didn't steal anything from the Greeks. Get out of here, history buffs.
Sneaky little hobbitses.
These protective spirits were assigned to individuals and places, and were credited with the major abilities of people, including acts of creativity. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and people believe that God is the only one who can truly create anything, and that humans lack all creative ability. Again, playing into this Greek notion of discovery and imitation. In fact, the well-known idiom, "there's nothing new under the sun," comes directly from the Old Testament. Although, to be clear, that was written way before the Middle Ages. As it turns out, the Book of Ecclesiastes really was the original "it is what it is." It wasn't until the end of the Renaissance and further into the Enlightenment that creativity starts to be seen as something that individuals possess within themselves. The Renaissance gave birth to a new interpretation of the term genius, where it now refers to individuals with exceptional abilities. And the Enlightenment paved the way for creativity to come more fully into the locus of control of individuals. The Romantic movement further builds on this idea of human imagination being the seed of all creativity. The Romantics also changed the common meaning of the term genius yet again. Now it begins to be associated in terms of an illness or a sickness, some sort of madness, which we can still see in the common stereotype of the tormented, doomed creative. Man, I love the Romantics. They were so goddamn dramatic. It wasn't really until the second half of the 19th century that creativity really began to stabilize in a way that would be recognizable to us today. And most of the formal psychometric research into creativity didn't start until 1950, when American psychologist J.P. Guilford addressed the APA. If this still somehow sounds old to you, let me just put it bluntly. For essentially all of human history, if you suggested creativity came from within individuals, you'd be looked at like you were fucking insane. And yet, over the course of the last 150 years or so, creativity's done a complete 180 faster than you can say Will Smith. Today, you'd get a similar reaction if you said that creativity came from anywhere other than individuals. Now, of course, creativity is not the only concept to have undergone such a drastic change in the last 150 years or so, but I do think it's important that we explicitly lay this out so we can all better understand where we're coming from, how we got to where we are now, and maybe understand a bit more about where we're going. The great outdoors. Two of my favorite things, doors and... Today, the dictionary defines creativity as the ability to create, or the quality of being creative. Where is it? Here. Here. The dictionary defines create as to bring into existence or to produce through imaginative skill. The definition that we're going to use for the rest of the video is the one that's generally agreed upon in the academic literature. There, creativity is usually defined as the process of making new and valuable products. The term new could be changed to something like novel, original, or unique, while the term valuable could be changed to something like appropriate or useful. The product being made in this case could be something like a physical product, a piece of art, a painting, but it could also be something a little more abstract like a scientific hypothesis or the solution to a problem. Now, this definition describes creativity in terms of processes and products, which differentiates it from another term that people often use interchangeably with creativity. That term is that term is imagination. Sir Ken Robinson, a British professor of arts education and incidentally the presenter of the most watched TED Talk of all time, described imagination as the generative force of creativity, or the engine. It's the idea generation phase of the creative process. With respect to imagination then, creativity can be thought of as applied imagination. Creativity has outcomes in the real world, it's not just in your head. Now, the more astute of you will probably already noticed there's a couple things wrong with our definition. I mean, first of all, what's new and what's valuable, and who gets to decide that? Okay, let's deal with new first. In creativity research, there's often a distinction made between little c and big C creativity. Little c creativity would be everyday creativity, something you do when you change your dinner recipe for the first time, or maybe you help your friend organize their room in a new way. Big C creativity, on the other hand, would be something much larger, domain-changing, lasting impact, something like the theory of relativity. Similar to this idea, CogSci research professor Margaret Bowden makes a distinction between psychological creativity and historical creativity, P and H respectively. Now, this might sound like it's getting complicated, but it's basically the same as little c, big C creativity. P creativity is a valuable product that's new to you, whereas H creativity is a valuable product that's new to everyone in history, or at least as far as we can feasibly know. So coming up with a new dinner recipe would be P creative, but not H creative, whereas Einstein's theory of relativity would be P and H creative? Exactly. Every instance of H creativity is necessarily P creative. Novelty to the individual is a necessary and sufficient condition for creativity, whereas novelty to the entire human race is merely sufficient. Okay, so that's novelty, but what about value? Look, value is essentially impossible to define in a useful way, and I'm not going to fool myself into thinking I can do that. Right, that's fair enough, but couldn't we try the same trick we did with novelty, where we delineate between little c and big C creativity and just see where that gets us? Work done by psychologist Him focuses primarily on what I would call an interpretation of big C or H creativity. This is known as the systems approach to creativity, and it says that the value of a new product is determined by the experts in the field within which the product belongs. The idea here being that creativity can't just exist up here. It must interact with the broader social and cultural context in order to be judged as creative or not. But it seems like the systems approach doesn't really leave much room for little c creativity. True, value in the context of little c would probably look something like the relationship between a parent and their child. For example, they might post the artwork of the child on the fridge because it's valuable to them. The problem is that none of these instances make any predictions about what we will consistently find valuable, or why we find them valuable. Honestly, there's just a million ways something could be considered valuable. And that's actually just okay for us. I'm way less interested in this endless discussion about how do we define value, and far more concerned with the current understandings of creativity we carry around with us daily. Luckily for us, so is actually every other person who's researched creativity ever. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration. There's certainly research into the other P's of creativity. For example, the well-known 5-factor model of personality. There's quite a lot of evidence there to suggest that individuals who test highly in the trait of openness to experience are more likely to engage in stereotypically creative behaviors. They're more creatively inclined, whether that's an internal motivation, a curiosity, or something like that. Creative places and external factors have also had some focus in research. And it seems like we can see that in Mihai Impossible to Pronounce Csikszentmihalyi's systems approach to creativity. And then there's products, which surprisingly doesn't get that much of the spotlight in research, even though the definition of creativity they most often use is the process of making new and valuable products. Creative processes, though? There are so many process theories of creativity, it's almost absurd. But there is one process theory to rule them all, one that I believe is the seed of all that is good and all that is utterly shit with the way we think about creativity today. That process theory is divergent and convergent thinking. Well, this is a slippery slope. So remember that guy who addressed the APA in 1950 and changed the course of creativity research forever? Yeah, him. J.P. Guilford suggested that there were these two ways of thinking. He initially referred to these as divergent and convergent production. Today, we know them as divergent and convergent thinking. Divergent thinking is about generating multiple ideas or solutions to a problem. It's about exploration, lateral thinking, and flexibility. Convergent thinking is about deducing the single or best solution to a problem. It's more about evaluation, inhibition, and the focusing of ideas. This distinction may seem innocuous enough, but from the very beginning there was a huge emphasis placed on divergent thinking for the creative process. Shortly after my man JP introduced this idea, divergent thinking quickly became used synonymously with creativity, and so the dreaded DT assessment was born. These popular assessments are still widely used today to test divergent thinking abilities, and by extension to make inferences about the creative abilities of individuals. And these assessments are actually pretty good at measuring divergent thinking abilities. The problem is the insatiable urge for even experts in the field to narrowly focus on divergent thinking as if it's the be-all and end-all of creativity. To be clear, this is an extremely simplistic view of creativity research, and there are plenty of other process theories out there. The thing is, this idea isn't just pervasive in the research either, it's pervasive in our cultural understandings of creativity. So now I'd like to take the time to talk about what I believe the creative process might look like, and address some of the common misconceptions and points of contention that I think we may have about it. More disclaimers. This is a narrow view of one theory of creativity. These misconceptions are my opinion. First of all, divergent thinking is about generating many, many, many ideas. Based on the definitions we laid out earlier from the late Sir Ken Robinson, we can actually say that divergent thinking isn't synonymous with creativity, but rather it's synonymous with imagination. Imagination is about generating ideas. Creativity is about manifesting those ideas in the real world as new and valuable products. Imagination, aka divergent thinking, is the engine of creativity. The immediate argument made from here is usually something along the lines of, well, clearly divergent thinking is required for creativity and therefore the most important thing to measure. And I agree, it's important to be able to measure divergent thinking abilities, but I'm going to suggest it's equally as important to be able to measure convergent thinking abilities. Not only do you need to generate ideas, but you need to be able to actually evaluate them and judge them and implement them in useful ways. For example, let's say I'm looking for creative Italian chefs, ones who are really good at making pasta dishes. Well, so you ask yourself, well, okay, what makes a good pasta dish? Well, it's probably the pasta, you silly goose. You need pasta for a pasta dish. So you go out perusing the streets and you find someone who's great at making lots and lots of different kinds of pasta. And you think to yourself, oh, gee, I must have found the most creative Italian chefs. But surprise, what you actually found was a fucking pasta factory. Goddamn Chef Boyardee's got more creativity than this. It doesn't matter how much pasta you have if you can't do anything with it. So making lots of different pasta is divergent. Selecting the right one and putting it into the tasty dish of your choice is convergent. Creativity is art, and therefore the opposite of logic and science. Even though it probably seems clear to you now that both types of thinking are required, we see this problem present itself in the broadest division of our entire education system, the age-old arts versus sciences dichotomy. Don't believe me? If I say the word creativity, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Art.
Probably like art, like artistic. Art, painting, maybe paintings. Paintings, art. I don't know, art.
Music.
Artwork, writing, music, stuff like that.
Painting.
Painting, coloring, drawing. Music, makeup.
This dichotomy plants the false idea that the arts, or being artsy, is somehow synonymous with creativity and therefore antithetical to logical, sciencey people. Now watch what happens when I ask them this question. If you guys had to try to define creativity in some way, what do you think you would say?
Like, what do you mean to define it? Yeah.
Like, if you were to try to explain to someone what being creative is, or like, because like an example of it would be painting.
It's like being different from
Being different from others.
Yeah, from others.
It's very hard to explain.
A particular skill, I think, a talent. A form of relief.
What's inside it? You feel like it's like, it depends on the person. It's like, what is like your type of style? Individuality.
That's a good question.
That one's hard.
The limits of your thoughts.
I'm not sure. I don't think there is. No, I think creativity is like endless.
It could be anything.
Yeah.
And just letting creativity really just put into your like own word. Like
Yeah, like, I don't know how to really explain it.
Yeah, or just like, I don't know, like coming up with new solutions to problems.
Making your ideas a real thing, just in any sort of way, just making them a physical, tangible item, piece of artwork, other than your own thoughts.
Honestly, just something that like is not off the mold. Honestly, something like inspirational, something like fantastical. Everyone has to stop and say, damn, that's pretty sick, you know what I mean? Like something like that, yeah.
everything you said.
Huge thanks, by the way, to all the people who said yes to being interviewed. This is not about showing how little these people know and how stupid they are. That's not the point. Many of these people had some fantastic thoughts about creativity. As seen in the past example, our process of approaching problems is so much more than just picking divergent or convergent thinking and leaving it at that. You need both, and you need both for arts and sciences. Creativity isn't over after one instance of divergence followed by one instance of convergence. We're constantly engaging in a dance between these two modes of thinking. I want you to try and solve this problem. Now, you can do it on the screen, but I'd recommend getting paper and a pencil. I encourage you to pause the video and give it a shot. Using exactly 4 straight lines, connect all 9 dots without lifting your pencil from the paper, or your finger from the screen if you're being lazy. Okay, so I hope you went and did that. Here is the solution to the problem. If you tried to solve this, let me know how long it took you in the comments. The challenge with this puzzle is to get yourself to stop seeing the square as a boundary. This usually takes a couple instances of diverging and converging. For example, you might start by seeing the grid as a hard and fast grid and you're only doing, dot to dot lines of 90-degree angles. Then you start to question it a bit and maybe you start doing diagonal lines, and then you start to question it more and you start to skip dots and draw straight lines that don't perfectly fit on the grid in the way you might have first thought. Until of course you stop seeing the square altogether and you're finally able to think outside of the box.
Thinking outside the box, yeah.
I like thinking outside of the box.
Puzzles like this require that you break up the initial framing of the problem and reconstruct new ones to explore. It's this ebb and flow of diverging and converging, defining and redefining that lets us solve problems efficiently. It's true that the arts are primarily divergent in nature due to the fact that there's an infinite number of ways you can approach artistic endeavors. I mean, the number of ways you can express sadness through a piece of art is infinite. I mean, you can write music about it, you can act it, you can dance it, you can sculpt it. And even within each of those categories, there's probably an infinite number of ways to express sadness. The sciences, on the other hand, are primarily convergent in nature. There's usually only one, or at the very least, few solutions to a problem. And to be honest, I don't think this does anything good for science either. Science is in a constant state of flux. It's not some objective thing outside of us. It is a process of investigating our best approximation of what we assume to be an external objective reality. That sounds kind of complicated, but it's kind of like history. We're constantly discovering new information and new context, and that lets us reinterpret the past. History isn't really this static and convergent thing. It's changing all the time, and in a lot of ways, I think that's science. Maybe that's a hot take, I don't know. I'm going to argue that regardless of the number of possible outcomes or solutions, the process of arriving there is fundamentally always going to be grounded in a process between divergent thinking and convergent thinking. We often think that because there's only one solution to a problem, that somehow means there's only one way of arriving at that solution. And we often teach kids to think this way in subjects. It's especially harmful in math. Obviously, there's only so many ways to solve 2 + 2 = 4, but I feel like even that has some wiggle room. I mean, maybe they could do it by counting on their fingers, maybe they could imagine 2 + 2 apples in their head, or maybe they know that 2 + 3 is 5, so 4 must be 1 less than that. I think this is one reason why some kids struggle so much in math. They're taught that there's only one way to get the solution because there's only one solution because sciences and math are convergent by nature and therefore they're inflexible and uncreative, so you better just memorize it. Most of the complex problems in math and most of the important ones require your ability to break up and reform your framing of the problem. If you can't do that, you won't arrive at a solution. Remember how our definition of creativity uses value and how value is really hard to define? Well, some people try to save the dichotomy between the arts and the sciences by making a delineation between the aesthetic value of art and the functional value of science. But even this just doesn't add up to me. If you've ever done any work in science at the university level, you will know from firsthand experience that simple solutions are often preferred. The beauty of a simple and useful scientific theory is in many ways as valuable as the actual function of the theory, and in many ways is a direct indicator of its function. It's this idea of parsimony or Occam's razor. The simplest solutions are preferred. And what about the arts? I mean, have you ever tried to write a fiction novel? Good luck. You better pray when it's all said and done that it's functional, that it tells the story you want it to tell in the way you want it to be told, and that people can actually, interpret it. Otherwise, it's just going to be misunderstood, misrepresented, or totally boring. This insidious opposition between the arts and the sciences causes other issues in our education system, particularly when it comes to actually teaching kids how to be more creative. If we continue to assume that teaching art is the same as teaching creativity, we are always going to fall short of the seemingly popular goal of wanting to increase creativity in our schools. And while the arts are clearly an important subject, they are not a substitute for teaching creativity any more than the sciences are. It's a dangerous mistake to think so. Testing for divergent thinking and teaching art as a subject or two isn't going to cut it. It's worth noting that even in the Encyclopedia of Creativity, on the first bloody page of the preface, they state, and I quote, "In the first edition, we stated that there was enough known about creativity that it could be integrated into every level of our educational system. Unfortunately, teaching to the test has become more prevalent in the United States, while arts programs have all too often been dropped." Evidently, we don't know enough about creativity to implement it effectively, otherwise we wouldn't be up in arms about an art class being removed. Now, of course, it's important for art classes to exist, but it's not gonna fix the problem of creativity in teaching.
Yeah, we've been working our best to do it.
More freedom equals more creativity.
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave with a box of scraps.
Another pervasive misunderstanding is this idea that more freedom is going to result in more creativity. To me, this seems to stem from a common definition of creativity that gets thrown around, which is that creativity is the freedom of expression.
Expression, like a way of like expressing yourself in a way that hasn't been done before.
Freedom, no barriers. Do whatever you want. You do it, you know? I mean, it's your work. You represent it the best because it is yours.
Now, it is true that you need freedom for creativity, but probably not in the way you expect. You're right, but for the wrong reasons. What creative freedom allows you to do is to choose your own constraints. It gives you room to define and redefine problems in ways that are useful to you. And it's through this act of defining and redefining and feeling out problems that I think we come to understand our own creative processes and hone them. When an artist starts working on a new piece, one of the first things they have to do is limit themselves. You know, maybe they'll start by doodling concepts and generating ideas, but immediately they have to make a choice. Like, okay, well, what's the style I'm gonna do this in? What medium am I gonna do it in? What's the composition look like? Where are the things in the frame? What's the perspective? What's the color palette? It's just narrowing until you get a finished product. You generate a bunch of ideas and then you evaluate them based on the usefulness and appropriateness to the piece you're trying to make. You diverge and converge. Christ, even kids who build cool shit in fucking Minecraft know how to limit themselves before they start working on something creatively. Some people even take things a step further by imposing elaborate challenges on themselves. Things like limiting themselves to only one color in a painting or writing a whole poem without the use of certain letters.
Kind of like, say if you picked a color and you stick to that color.
To me, creative freedom is about having the knowledge and freedom to push and pull the boundaries of the domain within which you're operating. Creative freedom is not the absence of constraint, it's the ability to choose. It lets you touch the limit, and from there you can choose whether or not you want to push it. In fact, this is likely the moment where a creative product becomes either P or H creative. I want you guys to try this. The next time you go to get your hair cut and they ask you what you want done, tell them to do whatever they want. They're probably gonna look at you like you have 7 fucking heads. Unless they're really good at the job, in which case they're gonna look and say, well, you know, it's been 3 months since they had their hair cut, so I know roughly how long to cut it to, and I know how they usually wear it. Plus, I know what age group they are, and so I can figure out what's fashionable for that group, and generally speaking, there's really only one way I can do it anyway. The risk of creativity. Oftentimes you'll hear people talk about the risk of creativity or, sometimes the curse of creativity. Even just the phrase, the curse of creativity, is so goddamn dramatic, you know it's got roots in the romantic notion of genius. In some ways, it makes a lot of sense. Novelty garners attention, and with attention comes threat and vulnerability. Standing out makes you a target for all sorts of negative attention, and being creative can make you stand out. In fact, it usually does. For example, if I asked you to put your Spotify playlist on shuffle on in front of your significant other's parents, you might just rather die under a rock. Like your creative products, the music you like says something personal about you. It makes you stand out, it puts yourself out there, it makes you open to judgment. And this isn't even to mention that creativity is at its essence a process of repeated failure, which in and of itself could be considered risky. Your time and energy is valuable. This is a combination of internal and external factors, of creative people and their environments, the people and place P's of creativity. So if you test low in the trait of openness and you don't like to take risks, and you're surrounded by a bunch of assholes who don't support you, the chances that you're going to engage in the creative process is probably pretty slim. To me, one healthy way to deal with the risk of creativity is to engage in a process known as iterative improvement. Rather than reinventing the wheel all the time, you consistently and slowly update wheels. The smartphone was revolutionary at the time it was introduced. I mean, it certainly reinvented the cell phone. It was H creative. But arguably since then, it's mostly done maintenance. Its core identity hasn't really changed that much over the years. To me, iterative improvement seems to leverage more convergent thinking than divergent thinking. It's less about new ideas and more about the evaluation and maintenance of already established value. In this way, you don't need to worry about being so radically different that everyone thinks you're a fucking lunatic. This is also pretty clear in the content creation space. I think it was Ludwig or Mr. Beast who suggested the yoink and twist method of creating.
I use that method every night at 1 a.m.
Rather than trying to be the next new big thing,
you just plagiarize.
No, bad. No, you don't. You take some really successful ideas, change them up a bit, and then regurgitate them in ways that make sense to you.
Plagiarize.
It's a classic case of Margaret Bowden's P creativity. You're not concerned with being new to the whole world, you're concerned with putting old ideas together in new ways that are new to you and maybe a couple other people, and that's about it. And that's creative enough. Oftentimes you get some of the best content out of this. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, you can still be creative while minimizing the risks.
But what if you wanted to reinvent the wheel?
This is where we get into the high risk, high reward stereotype that we usually associate with creativity. To make something truly new and original, if you're going for that H creativity, you're gonna want to spec into divergent thinking on your character sheet. And this is because divergent thinking is about idea generation.
This process might result in many more useless ideas overall, but the chance that you strike gold is increased. It's like the monkeys on typewriters. Eventually they'll produce a Shakespearean work.
A product accepted by others that was generated from this process is likely to be so novel and so unthinkable that it pushes the domain ahead many leaps further than the process of iterative improvement would have.
Or it could fail so miserably that everybody in society will shun you forever. Remember Lady Gaga? I mean, like, meat dress Lady Gaga? I feel like her early career is really well defined by the high risk, high reward style of creativity. Now she seems to be a little more focused on maintenance through her raw skill and talent.
I'm in no way saying Lady Gaga is uncreative. In fact, I'm saying the exact opposite. She's mastered creativity in many different ways over the course of her career. It's my hypothesis that primarily divergent thinking lends itself to more risk and more reward, whereas primarily convergent thinking lends itself to less risk and less reward.
Too far in either direction and you're either a gambling addict or a boring fuckwad.
Kids are more creative than adults. 98% of kids are creative geniuses, while only 2% of adults are. I'd wager most of you have heard this statistic somewhere, or at least something like it before. Well, unfortunately for us, this deep-seated belief that we all take on blind faith comes from a study conducted by George Land for NASA.
And here's the kicker, the study isn't even fucking real.
Well, to be completely accurate, as far as I can tell, it's never been published anywhere, and I can't seem to find it on the internet at all, which, if we're being honest, means it might as well not be real.
In fact, much like our working definitions, if there's no product around to be judged as new or valuable, it's not creative. It's just imaginary, sweetie.
To George Land's credit, I think what he said they studied was imaginative thinking, which, as we already mentioned several times, gets conflated with the monolith of creativity all the time. And to be honest, whether this study actually happened or not doesn't really matter, because I think we'd all carry around the belief that kids are more creative than adults. It seems like something we just have built into us.
And so naturally, I'd like to take a big steaming shit all over that idea.
For starters, to say that kids are more or less creative than adults seems like a poor way of initially framing the question anyway. It's a frame that forces us to assume it must be one way or the other. To me, the more appropriate question should be something like,
how do children and adults differ in their creativity, if at all?
This allows us to be a little more open to all possible outcomes. Under this framing, it's more appropriate to say things like kids are better at divergent thinking, whereas adults are better at convergent thinking.
And I actually happen to think that's the case.
I don't believe that kids are more creative than adults. I think that we both specialize in one piece of the creative process. Kids seem to generate more genuinely novel and unique ideas through their imagination, whereas adults seem better at focusing, judging, evaluating, and implementing those ideas.
For example, let's think about blanket forts for a second.
The blanket fort of a kid will probably be super original and novel and therefore creative in some respect. The blanket fort of an adult will probably be much more functional, it'll be more appropriate, it'll make better use of the available resources, and it'll also probably be a little mundane. Also, what the hell are they doing putting candles inside of a blanket fort? That's a fire hazard. It makes no sense. To me, these are just creative in different ways. One deals with the novelty and originality side of things, while the other deals with value and appropriateness. Consider this. ADHD appears to be characterized by higher levels of divergent thinking and lower levels of convergent thinking.
It turns out that rapidly generating thoughts about anything and everything all the time while lacking the capacity to focus long-term on the ones that are actually important turns out to not be a great strategy. ADHD is considered a disorder for a reason. Yet when we say things like kids are more imaginative than adults, therefore more creative, that's effectively what we're chalking creativity up to.
I think it's possible that the rose-colored glasses we tend to view childhood with influences our perspective on this.
We think back to how nice it was to have the freedom to play and to let our minds wander before the adult responsibilities of the real world came crashing down upon us and societal standards crushed our creativity. We dealt with constraints earlier. We see kids as these untarnished fonts of creativity and limitless potential.
And I agree, they are both of those things, but potential and imagination are not synonymous with creativity. Much like the light bulb metaphor, these qualities are merely a slice of creativity.
I think what he's trying to say is that kids are pasta factories. Adults are Italian chefs without pasta.
Asterisk. The previous arguments are part of a narrow and incomplete view of one process theory of creativity. There are plenty of other theories out there, many that don't rely on divergent or convergent thinking at all. And many of the points I've laid out seem to only really take into consideration one or two of the P's of creativity.
As we saw with the light bulb metaphor, there are other prerequisites to the creativity process that I haven't accounted for. Things like the knowledge necessary to start, the salience of the problem. There's also factors that affect motivation, internal factors, external factors, curiosity, personality traits, yada, yada, yada. In fact, much like Mihai, dear God, why is this a surname? Csikszentmihalyi's systems approach to creativity, our current understanding seems to have gone too far in the direction of the individual and not enough on other factors.
To me, there seems to be some hidden truth to the way we viewed creativity in the past. Not in the sense that there's some sort of divine spirit speaking through us, but in the sense that creativity is a process of imitation or discovery. And in many ways, I do think that when we're creating, we're just imitating the patterned nature of reality, or at the very least, the patterned nature of reality that we perceive.
In the wise words of the great chef Marco Pierre White,
"No, I didn't make Gordon Ramsay cry. He made himself cry. That was his choice to cry."
Sorry, wrong quote.
Let's not forget Mother Nature. She's the true artist. We're just the cooks.
So what do we do about these problems? To me, it seems important to focus on actually teaching kids the creative process. Divergent and convergent thinking may be a fine place to start, but it's probably just not nuanced enough. Recently, there has been a lot of talk about ways to approach problem solving, specifically ones that leverage the creative abilities of individuals. The two most common ones I know of are thinking from first principles and design thinking. Both offer a more tangible set of steps that we can teach. When it comes to creative people, maybe we're better off focusing on individuals who we consider to be naturally creative or talented, rather than trying to make every kid who goes through the education system some scientific fact memorizer or a glorified creative genius. We just cater to their individual strengths. It's also important for parents and adults to question their own views on creativity and make sure that they actually know what they're talking about and what they're advocating for. It's easy to just shout into the streets, "We need more creativity," but if you don't know what that means or what it looks like, then honestly, you're not helping. Art classes and an hour of free time are a start, but they're not a silver bullet. Of course, this is way easier said than done, and it's not like the problems we're facing are trivial. In the age of technology, social media, and content creation, we are creating and consuming more than ever before. The risk of engaging in creative behavior is at an all-time high, but so is the reward. The line between what is and isn't a successful creative endeavor is hyper-salient to us. Everybody is judging you. New ideas appear to be impossible in this sea of novelty that characterizes our modern society. And this novelty paralyzes us. What movie should I watch? Who should I date? What video game should I play? What should I create? What the hell do I do with my time? And if the way we consume creativity says anything about the way we internalize our own creative processes, good luck living up to that standard. To be crystal clear, we have so much to be grateful for, and the internet is a wonderful and powerful tool. But our current understanding of creativity is just not adequate for preparing our future generations for an exponentially changing world. I'm just some guy on YouTube, and I'm not exactly qualified to make policy suggestions about how we tackle this. This is not an easy problem, and maybe we can't figure this out.
Really? You're gonna give up like that? Give me a second. Creativity is collaboration. We work directly with people and indirectly with our collective human past. We are a culmination of lineage, immediate and distant, whether we know it or not, and whether we accept it or not. We're part of human progress, a creative process that pushes us ever forward, all the while unveiling an endless sea of doors waiting to be explored. Creativity is discovery. It's discovery of what is and discovery of what could be, of what's precious now and what could be precious later. Creativity is the interaction between our internal and external worlds. Creativity is life. It's the evolution of life on Earth. It's the sum of the lives we enrich by creating. Creativity is our universe, a swirling cosmic pool of infinite possibility tamed by the laws of physics. It's shifting, elusive, mysterious, always just out of reach. All our efforts to define creativity as this monolithic thing reduce it to less than it is. We've lost the kernels of truth found in our history of creativity. The purpose of this video is not to reduce creativity. It's to inspire you to be the kind of person who asks questions. Maybe I am just some guy on YouTube, and maybe we can't figure this out. Oh God. But I'll be damned if we don't try.